if you imagine a group of 8 lads, like the nicest and prettiest one, but he's still a lad.
Yeah.
Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, good 3 a.m. to all of you. This is House of Bards, a podcast about the shared narrative style of role-playing, game mastery, and playing.
It is.
That's absolutely what it is. I am Alex, and this is Beth.
I am Beth, indeed I am.
Mm-hmm. So what are we going to talk about this week, Beth?
We're going to talk about gods, pantheons, a bit of mythology,
Okay.
and the world in there that it takes place in. Cool. So a bit of a DM-heavy episode, but if you've ever played a cleric, you'll probably find this episode very interesting.
Mm-hmm. Or a paladin, or in
paladins.
a couple of places a monk. Monks tend not to be involved, but very occasionally they are. So, gods then. If we're talking specifically in the context of D&D, it's pretty difficult to avoid religion.
It is a bit, yeah. They do have their own set of gods and their own pantheon. I don't know that much about their own gods, unfortunately.
Well, I don't believe it's the same. I believe across all Wizards-controlled settings, there's this... each setting has its own pantheon of gods, but there's also a universal pantheon of gods. I know Bahamut is one of them, I think. I don't know much about the others. Lolth, I think, turns up quite a lot in various different settings. But yeah, going back to my original point, it is very, very difficult to escape religion in Dungeons & Dragons because it plays a fairly heavy mechanical role in characters' morality and also is the primary motivator behind the cleric and paladin classes. So while it is theoretically possible to have a world with no gods, even in that world, players have to play characters who think there are gods.
Yeah.
And in that case, then you're running into places where clerics and paladins are actually innately magical, but believe they are getting their powers divinely. Which honestly seems weird. You're going to have to do quite a bit of house ruling to get around the necessity of gods, goddesses, and other deities in Dungeons & Dragons. It's pretty required. I believe other systems are a little laxer on that requirement.
Yeah. I know that there are certain systems that are more into spirits of the land and stuff like that, and that's where perhaps you draw your mystical powers from rather than gods. But, I mean, Dungeons & Dragons is a bit peculiar in some ways because it very specifically has classes like paladins and clerics, and so you must therefore have some form of religion in your world, to an extent. So that makes it quite unusual, I think. Gods maybe make Dungeons & Dragons a bit more... I'm not necessarily sure if it's their selling point, but it definitely... a lot of them don't tend to bother with it or have gods and goddesses as flavour world-building stuff, like sagas of the Icelanders and stuff like that. And of course Apocalypse, where you can start your own cult. And that sort of thing. I mean, there are other settings that have gods and such in, but... This one's a bit more, they're very integrated into Dungeons & Dragons, shall we say.
Which is not necessarily to say that you can't be a bit flexible over how exactly the requirement for gods to exist is implemented into your world. And, this is something that I have taken quite a bit of interest in when writing aspects of Dawnsomber as a setting. I'm pretty sure you can attest that there's not really any two places with the same attitude to religion.
Yeah.
It's in Mestlin, for instance, they have a very, I'd say maybe traditional attitude to a pantheon of gods. And gods are very often pantheonic in D&D. For a variety of reasons. For one, especially in editions that do that, it allows different deity domains. For another thing, if you've been raised in a monotheistic culture, monotheism is generally pretty boring. So
Yeah, yeah.
It's an attraction to have a pantheonic system when it comes to deities, because it sort of removes the obligation for that god to be particularly universal in their desirability.
And it's more fun for DMs as well, because I think pantheonic gods, they give you a lot more range to play different characters.
And they introduce an aspect of inherent conflict into like the primal forces affecting the setting.
They do, yeah. I think that's why stuff like Greek mythology and Norse mythology kind of prevails today, and we still love it so much, and it's in so much pop culture stuff, is because you have these personalities associated with these particular gods, and the infighting and the stories that were told back then still travel down to date. I'm not calling the major monotheistic religions shit, and I'm not saying that your theology's crap. It's all very nice, but there's a reason why I suppose the pagan religions still live on in our hearts, shall we say.
So like Meslin is the sort of core area that's the most traditional in the way that its deities are set up. There are 24 deities in the Meslinian pantheon and 12 domains, 8 default ones and 4 custom ones. That are spread like around the gods, where like there'll be a god who just has that domain, and then there'll be 2 other gods that have that domain and 1 other domain for each of them. And they sort of like represent all aspects of life for these people. And they represent actually the like merging of 2 separate systems of belief, which is another trope that comes up a lot when you're talking about religion in fantasy universes, is they'll often be like places where 2 separate religions have sort of attempted to integrate with each other, which is not all that far-fetched, given it was a thing that did actually happen in real life quite a lot. I mean, early Christianity is dotted with attempts to integrate it into, like, the religious systems followed by powerful people.
I mean, yeah, like, every country you go into that has Christianity, it's taken on a part of the original folklore and mythology of their religion. I mean, you look at stuff like even Japanese Christianity, and their Mary is always in, like, the very traditional Japanese clothes, and she's always depicted as Japanese. Of course she would be. And Jesus, accordingly, looks like a small Japanese child. So that's something I find interesting.
Well, like, the kind of example I was going to use is that the reason we have Christmas in the middle of winter is because of early attempts to integrate Christianity with the story of Mithras, who, as far as the Romans were concerned, was the soldier deity. And if you get the Roman legion on side, you're probably going to be persecuted a whole lot less.
Yeah, and, like, Santa is Odin. Have you ever heard this? Santa's Odin, and the reindeer is his horse with the many legs. That's where that comes from. I mean, other the fact that Saint Nick I think he was a real person.
Yes, Saint Nicholas was a real person, yeah.
Yeah, but he's not, like, I hate to break it to you guys, but Santa doesn't exist. And he's not, you know, like, Saint Nick didn't have magical powers. He was just a very nice, lovely man, who did a lot of work for children at that particular time period. Odin is actually Santa. And delivers presents to children in certain folklore, which I find fascinating. So it's been changed around, obviously, to fit more into what we would assume is a Christian thing, because we can't have a one-eyed bearded man with many ravens coming into people's homes and giving them presents. That would be ridiculous. So it's a jolly fat man in a red suit.
Obviously.
Yeah. With a shit ton of reindeer. Though I like reindeers better than horses. I'm glad that was changed.
That's honestly probably the easiest kind of religion to set up for your world, because it provides sort of a set of highest authorities on all of the particular concepts that your players might want to be clerics or paladins of, and all of the particular concepts that your players might want to venerate.
Yeah. Like, religion can be important to a lot of characters. It can inform, I think, what's important to them, maybe a bit of their past. You know, like soldiers who worship war gods and stuff like that. That makes a lot of sense. And thieves who, are good in with trickery gods and such and the like. I think it definitely helps characters' characterization when there is strong religion in a universe where maybe that's important.
Bear in mind, however, it doesn't necessarily have to be a pantheon in order to have pantheonic influences.
No, of course not.
For instance, most systems of saints in modern Christianity, like Catholic saints and to a lesser extent other types of saint, sort of fulfill that same role of being like specific objects of like representation of a particular concept for veneration. So you could do that if for some reason you wanted to have a monotheistic system. Just have like lesser non-god beings who will act as sort of conduits for like worship around a particular concept.
Yeah.
What else? What other types of because this is the thing, is that I try not to repeat the same system of belief twice in two different countries. The Sparian temples on the Isle of Bells are kind of weird in that they're sort of like halfway between two systems. The way the Elven Empire does it is... the interesting thing about all the other systems of religion in the world is that none of them really involve creator gods. Like... pretty much all of them assume that the gods are simply like all-powerful beings who were created along with the universe and now rule over it. So the Elven Empire worships the old magic, which is the force that every single other religion believes genuinely did create the universe. But as far as they're concerned, like the elves are like weirdly aggressively atheist because as far as they're concerned, the old magic gods are gone.
Yeah.
Like, they are the true religion, but also they're just not here anymore. Which means if you're a cleric or a paladin and you're getting special powers from, like, divine worship, then you're probably in league with demons, because that's a logical inconsistency. You can't be getting special powers from worship of God, because all the gods are dead.
Yeah, it's true. Yeah.
They're pretty harsh on heretics. At least in places where they actually have the resources to punish them.
Yeah.
Most recently in the game I run on Tuesdays, a priest got off with a warning because in the place where she was caught, they didn't really have like a prison or anything to deal with her. Then you have the Kirk in Varash. And the Kirk is one of my favourite ideas for a religion, which is the Kirk do not really worship any gods, because the thing you have Meslin who are like no there's gods, the gods, and then there's demons, and then there's the Elven Empire who are like no our gods are the true gods, your gods are also demons, and then the Kirk is like it doesn't fucking matter, does it? Like demons and gods is the same. They're the same thing. They're absolutely the same thing. It's just all ultra-powerful exoplanar beings are the same. So, like, the Kirk don't worship any gods at all. Basically, they're just a sort of, like... if you imagine, like, 15th century hysteria over, like, Satan and evil and, like, nefarious forces beyond our control in, like, heaven and earth and down in hell, with all of the, like, gargoyles and shit and all of the gothic imagery, but without the central monotheistic conceit. That's what the Kirk is. The Kirk is just literally everything that lives on an exoplane wants to kill you, probably in an excruciatingly painful way. These are the ones that it's probably a good idea to get in with. So like they do have clerics, but the clerics are less like, you should worship my god, and more... they're a lot more like warlocks in the, this is the being I've decided to throw my lot in with. Really, the only distinction is that a warlock you actually have to make a contract with, whereas the Kirk acknowledges that there are some gods who are benevolent enough that you can just, like, join their political party and subscribe to their newsletter.
Yeah, no, I get you.
And it'll be fine.
Yeah.
But, like, the Kirk seems to take a very fearful view of, like, just gods and demons and all that shit in general, and doesn't really draw a huge amount of distinction between, like, making a deal with a very powerful devil or demon and worshipping a god, and just sort of becoming powerful enough that things will leave you alone.
Mm-hmm.
They're how to survive in a cruel world that hates you, which is very appropriate for Varash, I think, because Varash is a terrible place.
Yeah.
Where things just are awful all the time.
Yeah, well, I think that's it, isn't it? The religion of a place sometimes also follows the predominant kind of cultural thinking of that place.
If a religion is going to become culturally powerful, then that means that it has to sort of make some attempt to address the common anxieties of a populace. So it makes sense that there would be this very no-nonsense religion that isn't really, like, incredibly idealistic and is very practical in terms of this is how you can not die in a place where it is very likely that you will die in a horrible way without ever having really accomplished anything.
And, yeah, it's one that, you know, like, and to any DMs out there who are like, I don't really want to make my own gods up, or I don't really want to do this. This is something important to remember, but the pantheon or gods that you choose, whatever religion you choose, it will inform a lot about the world and what happens in that world.
Bear in mind, though, that if you're running a very small scenario like the one that we described in Getting Started, where, like, very little about your world has been defined yet, it is often not a problem if you want to just let anybody who wants to play a paladin or a cleric just make up a god.
Yeah.
As long as you're like, can I use this god later as, like, canon of the setting? There is at least one god in my setting. His name is Osiric, who, like, that was totally what happened.
Yeah.
Just made up for the first scenario, like, took what his domain likely was from the way that the player behaved, and I'm like, okay, he's a god now in this particular pantheon.
Yeah, like, it's what I did with demons in my setting. Matt was like, I want to play a warlock, and I was like, oh, Christ. And then I went, okay, well, what, you know, like, you made a deal with the demon, and then obviously, and then he came with this really great idea for the demon that he could have, and I think that's really good when players do that, not only with demons, but with gods, who are like, hey, what about this kind of a religion? And you're like, oh, that's very interesting. I like that. Well done, player, well done. Here's a piece of candy and a pat on the head. Go make your character.
This is weird now.
It is a bit.
But yeah, that does save a lot of work for you as well.
Yeah.
And I feel like the adherence to the old magic works a lot for the Empire, just because that means the Empire can be like, well, our god is the original gods. Like, they're not here anymore. All other gods are, by definition, lesser than the creators of the universe, so, like, obviously we're right. Like, with no real sense of practicality, just that, like, their dominant ideology gives them some sense that they are, like, better than everybody else, which is very much how Imperial Elves behave.
Yeah.
Not necessarily Bell Elves, but, like, definitely the Empire does behave that way.
Yeah.
And it allows them to be, like, very cruel and still think that they're right.
Yeah.
Whereas, like, Meslin are, like, the country that's kind of doing okay, so they have a variety of gods for if you're doing okay.
Yeah. In your world, I kind of imagine, like, the Empire Elves being, like, the literal Empire from, like, Star Wars, where, like, everybody's got, like, this really haughty, like high-class Queen's English British accent, and then you just get to the island
they do have those.
And then just get to the Isle of Bells, and everyone sort of speaks with a slightly funny West Country accent, because it's the most non-threatening one there is. Next to the Welsh, obviously.
Yeah, fair.
So, yeah.
Yeah, well, they're actually kind of... I believe comparisons have been drawn with, like, Warhammer's Imperium of Man.
Yeah.
And also, like, with the actual Roman Empire, which is indeed who they're aesthetically based on.
Well, yes.
Probably the most interesting religion I've come up with, though, is the Relendian religion. Because the Relendian religion is, like, honestly, possibly the most controversial. They have a completely different idea of what a god even is to everybody else. And if you remember the Alm Civvy from Morrowind, those of you who've played that, it's probably closest to that, and we can maybe talk about that in a little bit. In essence, what the Relendians do is that, like, at least Relendian gnomes and humans have these, like, I believe there's 7 of them. Nobody's visited Relend yet, so I'm still working out the details, but I think there's 7 of them, who are these sort of terrestrial, like, human demigods, in essence, who, like, they're incredibly powerful, and they are actually deities, but they're, like, real people who you could meet in the material world. And, like, the Relendians worship them because their definition of a god specifically excludes exoplanar beings. They're just like, no, we recognize that those beings are very, very powerful, and we recognize that the old magic created the universe, but as far as we're concerned, being a god is not just about how powerful you are. There's also, like, an implied level of responsibility, of, like, care and dominion over groups, like cultural groups of worshippers. And as far as we're concerned, if you don't exist in the same plane as the people over whom you have a responsibility, then by definition you are not a god. Which is controversial, and it's honestly only them who really believe that. But this is what I mean, like, that kind of thing, when I say you can play fast and loose with what the, like, definition of a god is. If you don't want to have, like, a traditional set of men and women in the sky. That definitely you can, like, obviously you can do the thing where, like, the traveller who you meet briefly on the road is actually the god of travellers and shit, but also you can just have, like, the gods are less powerful than supreme exoplanar beings, but they are real people you can meet and possibly briefly touch.
Yes.
Which is indeed, as I mentioned, how Morrowind did it, at least for one of its religions. And I know in Morrowind, like, throughout the plot, it becomes increasingly more clear that the Alm Civvy is illegitimate, but the way that they set themselves up as a religion is still, like, definitely worthy of analysis under this particular topic. Like, you are able to be exposed to, like, the exact means by which their power is limited, and where it comes from, and why it's inferior to, like, the power of the 9 divines or the Daedra Lords, but they're still gods, they're still worshipped, they are still part of our religion. It's not quite the state religion. There's some weird stuff going on by the time Morrowind actually happens, where it's, like, half integrated with the 9 divines, and it's sort of semi-autonomous. I don't know. It was strange, and, like, honestly, by the end of that game and its expansions, only one of the Alm Civvy is even alive, and can not be. So, I don't know. I think it's just a good place to start if you want to, like, look at different ways to do gods. Do you have something to say?
I was just thinking about the religion in my setting in 2 Earth is quite, similar. That gods all have some amount of presence within the world, and depending on the strength of their presence in the physical plane, it's how involved they are in people's day-to-day lives, to an extent. So you have Sinis, the god of sarcasm and wit, who is like, I mean, he's basically like, he's my Captain Ersatz of Loki, essentially, who sort of just sits there and is very smug and causes lots of mischief, and he has the largest presence outside, of course, the god of death, who just sits in his giant death palace in the desert and broods. And I think that's very, the idea of, that's sort of my idea of how involved the gods are in causing interference in our own lives, is how much presence they have in the physical plane and how much they mess about. So a god like, is it Shendar? Yeah, Shendar, who created the gods.
It's your setting.
Yeah, I know, I'm like, it's a lot of names to remember, but, you have someone like Shendar who created the gods and then isn't really that much further involved in everyone's lives, because they did this thing, and then they're like, well, that's me done. Peace out, everyone. I'm off to the existential planes to do god things. So, yeah.
Something I do find is that the one deity it is very easy for all of the religions in Dawn Zomba to agree on is Skedrenth, because in all honesty, it doesn't matter what you think Skedrenth is. Most religions agree that he does exist.
Yeah.
Because, obviously, Meslin thinks he's not quite the god of evil, but he's, the god of pillage, destruction, dragons, just general, not death, but, just being a fucker to people.
Yeah, god of not nice things.
Dude is not nice, and honestly, I am worried that in all the cases where he's actually appeared, he's come off as way more affably evil than he really ought to be.
Yeah.
In essence, he is, traditional depictions of Satan.
Yeah.
And so, that's why he's so easy for pretty much all cultures to believe in, because obviously Meslin thinks he's a god, everybody else thinks he's a demon, but pretty much everybody is sure that he does exist. In particular because, his interjections into the material world tend to be very dramatic.
Yeah.
The last thing he did of any real note was create the Dragon Triumvirate, which has been a talking point for most of the people who didn't get immediately murdered by the Dragon Triumvirate, and all of the elves who now hate the Dragonborn because of the Dragon Triumvirate. So, Skedrenth is quite often on people's minds as sort of this enemy of all that is good.
Yeah, he's a real knob. I believe our group has encountered him, actually.
Yes, although a very weakened form of him that sort of deigned to be, kind of more wacky than Skedrenth in his element might be. Because gods in each other's domains is severely weakened.
Yeah.
You're not really supposed to do that.
Yeah.
Something I did like doing with that particular pantheon was that not all of the gods are binary gendered. Some of them are not gendered at all. At least 2 of them do not necessarily really interact with the human concept of identity very much. The implication is that Tanithar and Zetchiundite are both sentient, but it feels weird to give them pronouns outside of it, because there's no real implication that they relate to, having an identity the way that a more human-like being would. And honestly, that is the kind of shit that you can very, very easily get away with in mythologies.
Yeah.
If you take nothing else away from this episode, I would say look up, the way that mythologies and, holy scripture, legends tend to be written. Because it's a very marked style. Obviously, some of it is attributable to the way that those particular documents have been translated. I don't believe that they were all, written in exactly the same style. But, you can look at that, and it's the kind of thing where it's a sort of... Either you're really, really going to enjoy writing that stuff for your own world, just because you, really, really enjoy the way that it's written, or you won't. But it's very much a Marmite thing.
Yeah.
I know a lot of people who really, really enjoy world-building scripture for religions, because they can really get into, the way that stuff is generally written. It's a very distinct kind of style. I love it. I'm fascinated with it, despite not being particularly religious myself.
I'm not so much a fan of writing that kind of stuff, because I can never really get my head around the way it's written because of the fact it's probably been translated 1,000,000 times. But I do think that stories about gods and folklore and theology, they are very important. That's what gives your gods their personalities, in a sense, and it's how we're able to go, man, look, he's such a little shit, because he's in all of these Eddas being a little shit and being a bit, and we know that Thor is a bit prideful and a bit of a lout, because he's doing all of this shit, and then him and Loki have to go and fix the shit, and somehow it's still Loki's fault. And you have Odin being a bit of a knob, to be honest. I've never liked Odin. I'm putting my hand down right now. Odin is a knob. Not in the same way that Zeus is a knob. Zeus is
an entirely different kind of knob.
Zeus is king knob of the knobs. He's terrible. Odin's a knob mostly in hindsight. Mostly
Odin is a knob in terms of makes poor decisions from a position of responsibility, whereas Zeus is a knob in terms of man who probably shouldn't have been given position of responsibility in the first place, occasionally remembers that he exists in position of responsibility.
Yeah, like, my favourite thing about Odin, right, is that he looks at this giant man-eating dog and he's like, well, because your father basically killed my son, I'm gonna tie you up to my throne. Nothing bad can possibly come of this. Ragnarok comes round. What's the first thing that happens to Odin? He gets ate by the giant wolf that he enslaved. What did you expect, Odin? What did you expect? Zeus, on the other hand, is just like... Zeus is someone else entirely. He's a real... he is a terrible person. Let's make this one thing clear. Zeus is a fucking... awful person. To
be even more clear, like, Poseidon is also a terrible person. Like, it's not like the entire Greek pantheon revolves around, like, nice people and Zeus, who is in control of all of them. Like, Hades is alright, but he did do that whole, like, shit with Persephone, which doesn't quite go the happy way that you'd want it to. No. Like, quite a lot of the stuff that you've heard that sort of softens that story is, unfortunately, apocryphal. I mean, obviously, you do have to take the "it was a different time" filter, and there's no way he's as bad as Zeus or Poseidon, but...
I mean, like, maybe the one decent god is Hephaestus, right? That poor guy. He's all like... He's a bit broken, but he's still good, and Zeus is just like, I love all my children equally, except you, Hephaestus, get the fuck out of here. And Hephaestus is like, the fuck, Dad? The fuck?
In all honesty, like, it's not really surprising that the Greek gods are pretty fucked up if you look at the home that they came from.
That's true.
Like, the Titans were terrible.
The Titans are Titans' worst parents ever. What did you expect Zeus to turn up when he was raised by those assholes? Seriously. It all relates back to home and how people are brought up, unfortunately, sometimes. And, yeah. You have most of the Norse gods are generally quite practical because they came from a very hardy, practical people, but they're all very fated. The Vikings fucking loved fate.
The Norse gods are a pretty good representation of the fact that if you have a pantheon, then that means that you don't have to have all of your divinity's behaviour be divine.
Yeah.
Because you can have gods of the less savoury aspects of your culture's behaviour. The Greek gods do this as well,
yes,
and
definitely.
So do a number of other pantheons, but,
Loki, god of thieves and trickery, and also male homosexuality, which is absolutely fascinating. But yeah, the guy is, I love Loki, and I don't like it when he basically gets turned into Satan in modern depictions. Like, I don't like it that they do that with Hades as well, but I can kind of understand with Hades.
It's very inappropriate to do with Hades. Like, Hades has the aesthetic, but he really doesn't have the personality, the text to back him up.
Yeah. Hades is just kind of this sad, mopey kind of...
Loki is a bit more of an asshole, but I feel he is still more nuanced than basically Satan.
Yeah. Like...
In all honesty, Satan is more nuanced than basically Satan.
Yeah, he is. Yeah, it gives Satan a bit of
credit.
He's
not even a god, but he's a mythological figure who does actually have a fair amount of nuance behind him.
Yeah.
I believe it is sometimes said in atheist circles that possibly the first step of disillusionment is when you start kind of agreeing with Satan.
Yeah.
Which is possibly the main reason why it's so difficult for people raised in heavily Christian households to break out of that, because honestly, that's not a good start.
Yeah. Good guy Satan. Oh, that's a great meme.
Quite a lot of Satan's trickery is just Satan turning up to key important people and talking to them and being like, God's being kind of a knob.
Yeah.
And he's usually right. We wouldn't accept that behavior from human beings.
Yeah. He's like, Jesus, I could give you some food if you wanted to, and Jesus is like, I'm good, thanks, I'm good. And it's like, this does seem like a bit of an abusive relationship. You're giving everything to everyone, and have you ever thought that maybe we don't deserve it, and that your dad's a bit of an a-hole, and Jesus is just like, oh God, Satan, please, not right now. Okay, I've got to do this.
Eve, did he tell you not to eat from that tree? Alright, good. Did he tell you why? Because I kind of feel it's right there, it's kind of an asshole thing for him to put it there and then not tell you why you shouldn't eat from it, especially since this whole garden is supposed to be, like, for you. I mean, maybe it is a test of your obedience to him, but it seems like a really pointless test, to be honest. And it's kind of counter to, like, basically this test is attempting to teach you a lesson that I'm not entirely sure you're actually going to need if you're going to stay in this garden forever and just live forever. It seems strange. Why would he even put it there? You should eat some of it, because honestly, I think we all want to see what's going to happen, because he's being kind of an asshole. Just saying, yeah. I'm just saying.
Hey guys, have you...
Also, where are my legs?
Yeah, also, hey guys, have you noticed, like, ever since God made all these humans, he's not really been paying that much attention to us anymore? I don't think he really appreciates all the work that we do for him, and I think he's kind of ignored us. Like, I think these are, like, his new favourite toy. I'm not necessarily down with that, guys, and I think he's kind of treating us all like crap. I think we should rebel, because it seems like all we do is just all of this paperwork for him, and he never really gives us anything in return, and we're clearly some of his most brilliant creations, and, you know, I just don't think it's very fair. So, what do you say, guys? Revolt? Or, like, yes, no? What do you think? Poor Satan. Always maligned.
So, you're listening to House of Bards, your premier Satanist podcast.
Premier Satanist and Steven Universe podcast.
I mean, I don't believe that we're the only Satanist Steven Universe entity out there. But you might have to dig a little while to find the others. Oh dear.
Goodness.
So, if you still really don't want to come up with this stuff on your own, I mean, for a start, there is the general pool of deities for Dungeons and Dragons, like, you know, just across all settings, which you can use. Mm-hmm. Or you could do what Magic the Gathering did and just sort of, like, make weird XPs of an existing pantheon of gods.
That's what I did.
Because, like, a couple of the roles were swapped around for the Theros set, and, like, some beings who in mythology were not gods, like Sharon the Ferryman, got turned into gods. But in all honesty, like, Theros is ancient Greece, and the Theros gods are more or less the Greek gods. Like, that's their whole deal. And that's fine. Like, there was a decent amount of lore there, even though, like, you know, Heliod is Zeus, and also Helios. That was a bit weird. I think they did actually try, and they didn't just, like, mask everything. But, like, you can just do that, and the thing about actual pantheons is that they did generally cover all of the topics that people were generally concerned about in a society like that. Or, you know, you could also run a historical game, like my friend runs, which is actually set in ancient Greece, and then you just get the whole ancient Greek pantheon.
Yeah.
I am playing a cleric of Dionysus in that group. It's really fun. Partly because he, like, is ostensibly supposed to be, like, this, like, good-natured party animal. But he is honestly pretty much the only party member with any morals whatsoever.
Welcome to ancient Greece. Enjoy your stay. We're low on morals and we're low on money.
Like, I imagined him as, like, this like, good-natured but debauched drunkard.
Yeah.
Like, basically, like, if you imagine a group of 8 lads, like, the nicest and prettiest one, but he's still a lad.
Yeah.
But, like, no, actually, he's just basically going around all the time like, you all need Jesus.
Yeah.
Really? Fuck is this? What's going on? Am I the only person who thinks, like, stuff like molesting children is wrong? I mean, he was exaggerating there. What they were doing was not actually molesting children. It was, like, leaving children to be eaten by monsters. But tying them up to make sure that would happen. Yeah.
Just, like, that poor cleric, he's just in such a morally bankrupt, like...
Like, when, like, a divinely obligate drunkard is your source of morality, possibly you are bad people.
Yeah. It's like that, you know that episode of Futurama where all of the robots
I probably don't, but go on.
All of the robots have like a secret society, and Bender turns out to be like the one who's like, hold on a minute, do we really want to kill all the humans, guys? And they're all like, yeah, we want to kill all the humans. Speaking of which, there is a hedonist robot in that who is like who's like a cultural depiction of Dionysus, and I think that's quite funny. So yeah.
We could talk about like the Egyptian gods.
Yeah. I don't know a great deal about the Egyptian gods actually, which is kind of.
I think that like in comparison to the Greek or Viking pantheons, the Egyptian gods tend to be a little bit more descriptive rather than prescriptive. Like they have less of a role in the everyday goings on of the culture over which they like have purview, and it's more like a lot of basic cosmic functions of that society are explained as being the responsibility of gods. Yeah. So they're not necessarily like gods who will enact like severe punishment on you on a whim. They're more like, this is the deity behind this particular process.
Yeah.
But that's honestly a guess, really, from like the minimal research that I've done.
Yeah.
And there were quite a lot of gods in that pantheon, so it is possible that I am entirely incorrect. If I am, maybe put that in a comment or contact us somehow, because I'm sure that would be very interesting for people to read about.
Yeah, I think what's interesting about the Egyptian gods is, well, the ancient Egyptian gods is, they're kind of this combination of like animal and human, and animals that were generally in Egypt at the time, and that's something I find very interesting when.
Well, we know that religion was pretty animal focused.
Yeah,
like, animals were very important, and that makes sense.
Yeah.
You know, there was quite a bit of agriculture going on, and like a lot of domestic animals as well. Like animals were important in that society, so it makes sense that like your descriptive deities would like reflect that. So this is also something to think about when you are coming up with your own pantheon, is like, what kind of theme are you likely to go with for like deities that these people might have? And admittedly, this is more difficult to do in a fantasy universe where ostensibly all of these deities are provably real, because then it becomes a little bit more weird that all of the deities who like seem to come from a society making them up based on what's important to them are actually real. Unless, as I mentioned last podcast, you read Neil Gaiman's American Gods, where by that system it makes complete sense why that would happen. But then, of course, if you're using those mechanics, that's going to create other different problems for you as to like how deities actually work. And actually, you may feel that it gives players a power over the cosmic realm that you possibly don't want them to have.
Yeah.
I'm being very vague here. Read Neil Gaiman's American Gods. Like, it's a pretty out there work on this subject. I mean, I know I said it was relevant to last week's topic. It is. It is also very, very relevant to this week's topic, because like this stuff is what it's actually about. So it's just a really good book to read about this stuff. It's honestly just a pretty good book in general. The main character is kind of bland, but not really unlikable, so it's fine.
Yeah, I've sort of started thinking about the comic book, The Wicked and the Wicked and the Divine, by Kieran Gillen and Jamie McKelvey, which is the idea of like all the gods from like every pantheon exist and are reborn into our world every 90 or so years, which is an interesting concept on its own. And also, when they are reborn, they become pop stars. But that's kind of aside from that, because you have these gods with these very interesting personalities, and they're all interacting with each other in kind of like cross pantheon interactions. Like, you know, the idea of someone like, you know, Lucifer and Baphomet interacting with each other, and Morrigan and Baphomet interacting with each other, is a very interesting idea, which I think is kind of the similar idea behind American Gods, isn't it? That you have gods from different pantheons interacting.
Oh, actually, another work to check out in relation to this, and this is also a series that I have mentioned before, on the podcast, check out The Long Dark Tea Time of the Soul, which is the second story in Douglas Adams' short-lived Dirk Gently series, which does actually deal with specifically this issue. So yeah, the first one is good for time travel. Second one, good for deities. I personally would recommend that you check out the BBC radio drama, because that's my favoured method of consumption of that particular story, and it's really good. That one doesn't have Billy Boyd in it, except very briefly, because it's about other different characters, but it still has a large amount of the rest of the core cast. Like, the people who are in it are very good, and it's still by Dirk Maggs, who is a very wild-haired man, seemingly obsessed with keeping all of Douglas Adams' stuff going. So I definitely recommend it, and it does deal with, like, specifically the concepts of what a god is and what happens when you stop believing in a god.
Yeah. Well, that's something that shows...
There's a lot of overlap between that and American Gods.
It's something that's similar in Terry Pratchett, isn't it? That the more you believe in a concept, the stronger that concept is in that world. And so if you believe in a god, belief in a god makes it real, essentially. So you have this sort of concept in the Terry Pratchett Discworld where, while you know the gods are real, you refuse to worship them because they're always a dick to you. It's kind of the idea of like Natheism, but I think there is a proper term for it where you believe that God exists, but you refuse to worship him on the grounds that you don't like them very much, basically.
This is much easier to do in like fantasy worlds where the gods are like known quantities.
Well, yeah, that's it, isn't it? Like,
yeah. And it is honestly like one of the founding principles of the Kirk. Yeah. As I explained before, that like the Kirk is like, this is who you can afford to piss off if they're a dick to you.
Yeah. Like
the one the principle behind the Kirk that I wanted to put in was that the Kirk are very, I don't want to say humanity, like I don't want to say they're like pro-humanity.
Yeah.
But whatever a collective noun would be for like humans and other human-like sapients, so like orcs primarily, but also like anybody else who wants to be as mortals, we'll say. The Kirk is very pro-mortal. The Kirk is honestly kind of like a trade union for mortals.
Yeah,
it's just like, if you join the Kirk, you're offered some minimal amount of direction and protection from people who can otherwise just sort of batter you around.
Yeah.
Like, without any real care. It's the relieve your cosmic horror a little bit service.
Yeah.
Which I think definitely makes sense for the setting. And it's definitely a way that you could look at... Honestly, that's one of the roles that religion tends to traditionally fulfill as well. So really all I've done there is I've taken a very bog standard, possibly even monotheistic religion, and just removed just cored it out.
Yeah.
And like removed the central premise, and then just all of the paraphernalia is still around, which is like, you could experiment with removing different parts of existing religions and seeing how they alter and like what set of circumstances might cause them to arise.
I know that in my setting we have the nomads, who are largely monotheistic, but they've taken that to mean as, while we recognise these other gods exist, this specific god is ours, and that's the one that we're going to worship. And so that's what they do. They recognise, yes, other gods do exist, and belief in them isn't necessarily wrong, but we are the nomads, we are her people, therefore we will worship her. Because, to be fair, she is the goddess of nomads, and other things like fertility and large jungle cats.
And presumably the fertility of nomadic large jungle cats.
Yes. Leopards really appreciate her input in their lives. Are leopards nomadic? I think they are. Anyway.
I feel jaguars probably are.
They definitely are. So, yeah. But yeah, it's the kind of idea of, we know there are other religions and gods out there, but we like this one the most, and we think we think we're sticking with this one. Unless, of course, you have some sort of crisis of faith and decide to worship the god of death instead.
And be a pirate.
Yeah.
Pirate.
Pirate.
So, yeah, I feel like if you're going to take any step into this world, into this topic in your world, you need to think very heavily about what religion is, what purpose it's supposed to serve, like what problems it addresses, and also how many of those things are modified or affected by the presumption that all religions are true. In fact, I'm pretty sure all religions are true is the tagline of, like, the central conceit of a couple of fictional properties that we haven't mentioned. So maybe go and seek some of those out. In any case, I would definitely recommend reading or otherwise consuming all of the things that we have mentioned.
Definitely go read Wicked and the Divine. It's wonderfully drawn.
Pretty... Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Throwing a comic recommendation out there. We don't talk about comics that much. Not indie comics, anyway.
We had a conversation privately about comics that, like, probably wouldn't be that off topic for the podcast at some point. I mean, at this point, we kind of just got to pick up whatever we can as a podcast topic.
Yeah.
I would recommend reading American Gods and listening to all of Dirk Gently, or reading it. I would say listen to it, but, you know, the books in that case did come first, so you could read them if you wanted to. Mm-hmm. I just generally find that I have more time for, like, books that are in audiobook or radio drama form. Mm-hmm. So that's generally what I end up consuming while I'm doing other things.
Cults,
yes. What? Cults can mean a lot of different things in a fantasy universe where gods are real.
Yeah. I think
maybe there's a particular god worship of whom is banned, in which case all worship of them is a cult. Maybe there is a particular being that there is heavy dispute whether they even are a god or not, in which case worship of them is a cult. Maybe there is a being who is not really a god at all, but behaves in a way that means that adherence to them is analogous to worship of a god, in which case worship of them is a cult.
Yeah.
Maybe the cult is an atheistic cult, but they behave in a really cult-like way, so they're a cult.
I think there's also other types of... There's end-of-the-world cults who think imminent doom is going to be brought upon us. And I think as well, the thing with cultists is they afford you a lot less nuance with religion and stuff like that, because cults tend to be evil in fantasy settings. You can have a lot of fun with them that way.
Well, yeah, I mean, like, the only cult, I think, that has really turned up as of yet in Dawnsumber would be the cult of Vesusark, and, like, their reason for existing is pretty clear. They think that the restrictions placed by the government on the legitimate temple of Vesusark make that temple illegitimate. So they're like, well, we're the real church.
Yeah.
But also we do all these weird cult-like things, like we draw on our bodies a lot, and very occasionally we put people on altars, and Vesusark strikes them by lightning, and they turn into, like, weird blood magic abominations.
Nice!
Who, like, run really fast and have voices that fill the room and do magic at the expense of their own health, like, way beyond their own level. Which, honestly, was all much more impressive in 2nd edition, before 5th edition was like, magic is a lot more accessible now.
Oh, man.
Like, I was never really sure where to take the Scriveners, so I'm kind of glad that you guys chose the path where interaction with them is kept at a minimum.
Yeah. In my setting, there are quite a few cults, but I think the main one is the cult of Oberon, which, if you know anything about fairies...
Oh, yeah. I've been in a play with this guy.
Yeah.
I was in a school production of A Midsummer Night's Dream.
Oh, that's lovely.
I was bottom.
Oh, you were.
We did have an Oberon.
Yeah.
And actually, like, compared to the rest of us, dude was huge.
Oh, yeah. He's got to, like, Oberon's got to have a bit of presence.
Oh, he had a lot of presence.
Yeah.
Like, honestly, like, I was in year 11, so I was probably actually, like, pretty tall.
Yeah.
But I just remember this dude as being, like, this gigantic endomorphic brick house. I didn't know him. But he definitely fit the profile of, like, the giant king of the fairies.
Yeah. We love a bit of Oberon. I love a bit of Oberon. Speaking of which, actually, did you know that originally Jay was based slightly off Puck from A Midsummer Night's Dream? Which
no, but I can believe it.
Well, there you go. That's where I drew inspiration from initially, and then obviously I watched Steven Universe, and I was like, this character is Steven Universe now.
I mean, like, I could also vaguely see Ariel from The Tempest.
Right. Yeah, I don't know.
But honestly, quite a lot of Shakespeare's, like, small, like, obedient sprite characters kind of run together.
Yeah.
It's like not incredibly, and also the thing about Puck is that like Puck is pretty well defined, whereas depending on what you want the theme of your production of The Tempest to be, Ariel is a whole load of different things. Like sometimes Ariel does not even necessarily have a humanoid form.
Yeah.
It's just a sort of like cloud of gas.
Yeah. Whereas like Puck's this oh shit.
I mean, like Ariel's advantage is that in The Tempest, Ariel is like basically the only spirit. I think there is like a moment where like a fuck ton of spirits turn up at one point, but it's not like A Midsummer Night's Dream where you've got fairies basically all the way through.
Yeah, see, I've never seen Tempest, right? The way you're describing it makes it sound like the movie Xanadu.
I've never seen the movie Xanadu, so I don't know if we're going to be able to make this connection.
Right, Xanadu is about this guy trying to build a roller disco, literally because a manic pixie dream girl, like, and that's quite literal, right? Comes down and is
as in she's an actual pixie.
She's not a pixie. She's actually actually a muse. I think she's the muse of dance or whatever. And she comes down and she's like, "You have to build this roller disco, man. Like, realize your dreams." And he didn't want to build a roller disco before. I think he just wanted to like paint and stuff. And somebody was like, "Yes, we have to build a roller disco."
This is honestly not what I was expecting when you started to describe the movie Xanadu.
Well, yeah, it's so weird. Like, and then there's like a random animated bit in the middle, and then at the end, the roller disco gets built, and then the muse is just like, awesome, and then she like sings a song, and then she like disappears into stars, and she returns to Zeus, and it's like, okay, cool. And then she's just left this artist with this roller disco because she wanted to dance in a roller disco.
I can 100% guarantee The Tempest is not like that.
That's a real fucking shame.
Real briefly, The Tempest is the last place Shakespeare ever wrote, and there's quite... you know that Shakespeare always had a self-insert character in every one of his plays?
Yes.
In The Tempest, his self-insert character is the wizard.
Nice.
I can't remember his name. I can basically not remember the names of any of the good characters, but the principle is that the wizard is really old and constantly thinking about how he's going to die, or at least that's the subtext. He doesn't talk about it a lot.
Right.
But he and his daughter got like sent away from Naples, like they were banished, like a while ago when she was a baby, and he lands on this island where a witch called Sycorax has had this horrible like weird ape-like child called Caliban. And because he's a powerful wizard, which might be the reason why he was like thrown out of Naples, or was it Venice to begin with, some Italian city. This dude can just like take control. And he has a servant sprite called Ariel, but also Caliban obeys him, but Caliban does not like obeying him, and also constantly talks about wanting to rape his daughter.
Oh my god.
That bit is a bit displeasing, but like the central conceit of the plot is that a ship traveling from Naples, I know the ship is from Naples,
right?
I don't know if the rest of them are, containing like a prince, crashes on the island, and like basically the whole story is about how all of the survivors from the shipwreck like come out and try and survive, while this dude like just sort of stands around commanding his minions to play tricks on them and being weird, and his daughter falls in love with the prince and asks her dad to please stop playing pranks on him and stop being angry at him. I think possibly the two of them must be from Naples, because otherwise there's no reason for the wizard to be like really angry at these people.
Yeah.
So this has been the half-remembered plot of The Tempest.
When my history teacher, sorry, not English teacher, said The Tempest is boring,
The Tempest isn't boring, it's just fucking weird.
I know, that she said, oh, it's a bit boring, it's not very good.
Like, within the context of plays that Shakespeare wrote about himself,
yeah,
it's honestly one of the most interesting, because, like, it's... Obviously, you know, in Romeo and Juliet, for instance, Mercutio is the...
Obviously.
self-insert character for Shakespeare, where he's fucking Mercutio. Like,
yeah.
Honestly, there are a whole load of things that Mercutio is, but really just read or watch the play to get a sense of what some of them are. Mercutio is a riot.
That's probably why Mercutio has this really strong, like, bi vibe in the play, because...
For real,
like, yeah. You're like...
Whereas the Wizard Prospero is just, like, this incredibly bad-tempered old man who has basically, like, no future vision whatsoever, and, like, isn't a bad person, but is honestly, like... both incredibly tired and incredibly frank about, like, his... Basically, he thinks he might not necessarily die on the island, but the, like, whole capacity for meaningful work in his life is coming very close to having been expended.
Dang, Shakespeare, that's deep.
Obviously, in this case, Prospero is talking about how he's basically reached the height of his powers, and he has not really done... sufficient stuff that would make him be not exiled, and like this has come to the point where this is the event that will have defined his life. But Shakespeare is talking about how he's old now and he's probably done writing his best plays, and he likely isn't going to write another one. I should point out that apparently we are technically guessing that The Tempest is Shakespeare's last play, because we don't know for sure what order they came in. But it's pretty much presumed that there is... Oh, but there is also a, like, comic relief side plot with two characters called Trinculo and Antonio, who spend most of their plot with Caliban in tow, because Caliban has been sent to troll them. It gets weird, like, pretty quickly. The daughter's called Miranda. I don't know if at this point that's particularly relevant. The Tempest, by comparison, does not have anything whatsoever to do with the topic that we were talking about.
No, it doesn't. It doesn't at all. Unless we do just become Bardcast, which...
Honestly, I mean... I feel that after you have fought literally Shakespeare, he might not be cool with us being Bardcast. We've burnt that bridge before we even got to it.
No, yeah. Sorry, Shakespeare.
I don't know necessarily if there are any Shakespeare plays that deal with this particular topic. I don't think, like... I don't know that, like, paganism is entirely absent from Shakespeare.
It's certainly not, no.
But I don't know if he ever really, like, did a history that talked about, like, a culture where a paganistic religion was just normal. And I think if he did, he wouldn't have gone a huge amount into...
He probably wouldn't have, no.
No.
Because I don't think the rich people he was writing it for would have appreciated it very much, since they were probably very Christian.
Some of the stuff that you see in, like, Shakespeare's plays shows that he was allowed at least a bit of leeway on, this is a history, so this is these people as they were.
Yeah.
Which is bullshit, because Shakespeare made up a whole load of crap.
Yeah.
Never happened. But, like, it's at least implied that his audiences could understand that, like, that it's a history, and it's not saying that this stuff is necessarily true.
Yeah.
But I just don't think he did any that were about, like, Vikings or ancient Greece, or I feel like of the famous like pagan societies, the Greeks and the Romans would be the most accessible to Shakespeare.
Yeah.
Like, honestly, the Vikings would have been a lot more recent and a lot less respected.
Yeah.
And I feel like the ancient Egyptians are the kind of thing that maybe they hadn't even heard of.
I don't think that's necessarily true. I think we did.
I mean,
know.
Possibly they did. No, I think, like, it would be the kind of thing that people in this country would have heard of in previous time periods, but which might not have been incredibly relevant at that particular time.
Yeah, because I mean, it's Egypt isn't
exactly
that, like, deep Africa, is it? Like, it was an explored bit of the world, so presumably.
I'm not saying that word wouldn't have reached it previously. I'm just saying that probably not a huge amount of news about that kind of thing reaching Shakespeare. Because I don't know if it would have been relevant. Yeah. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe. If I am wrong, please leave a comment explaining so, because that would probably be very interesting. Mm-hmm. It's just basically turning into Alex doesn't know anything about ancient Egypt, the podcast. So I guess in payment for last week, I'm just going to leave all of this, of me sounding like an idiot, in.
Yeah. Good.
That seems fair.
Did you know that when there were woolly mammoths around, the pyramids were beginning to be built? That doesn't sound like a real fact, but unbelievably, that's a real thing.
There's an entire Reddit thread, isn't there, that's just like things that happened at the same time in history that you didn't really think would happen.
I know.
Like Oxford University is older than like
calculus, yeah.
No, not calculus. It's older than is it the Maya? It's one of the South American civilizations.
Incredible. It's the world is.
If you know which South American civilization Oxford University is older than, do please tell us in the comments, because that would be interesting. Or just link the original Reddit thread. Yeah. I would like to read it again.
I mean,
because it's really interesting. Because it has stuff like Martin Luther King and Anne Frank were born in the same year.
Yeah, I mean, you have stuff like even just related, you know, and I think this does sort of relate to it somehow. But like, we think of a lot of South American ancient civilizations as being ancient civilizations, and actually they were fairly recent. Like, they're not that old, really. Like, comparatively, and I find that really interesting. You know, I mean, there are still monotheistic religions around today as well, and you would think, you know, and they've been around for years and years and years, and they still exist.
Well, that was the huge problem, wasn't it, with like everybody freaking out about 2012, because there were a whole lot of like news agencies that were like, "What would the Mayans think if they could see us now?" And they're like, "They can." They didn't die out, guys. Their civilization like doesn't look the way that it was before, and they've like integrated into a lot of other South. But there are still Maya. They still exist. There are still real people who have jobs and go to school and whatever.
I know, and like, you know, all these Maya are like,
it's bullshit. So we're going to be fine.
Yeah, calm down, guys.
Because that's not even what, like, that's not how that calendar works.
Yeah.
And also, it's probably not true.
Yeah.
So you're doubly safe. Don't worry about it.
Yeah. I mean, like,
basically, what we're saying is that the 2012 hysteria was really racist.
Yeah.
Because it was.
Yeah.
And it was also ridiculous.
Yeah. I mean, you know, not to rag on any culture here in particular, but I don't think any culture ever has had the foresight to tell when the world is going to end. Because
there are some that have like myths that establish that the world is going to end, but I think most of them have not really like
they haven't specified
made an attempt to specify a date.
Yeah. Because you can't I think you're going to look like a bit silly.
I do think that like the end timer cults in modern Christianity have like somewhere where they're drawing dates from.
Yeah.
Although actually I think mostly they have a list of criteria that need to be met. And then it's just as soon as all of these criteria are met, the world will end.
That's
and
interesting.
That's a good thing for some reason, and we should try and make that happen.
I would like to see the inner workings of an end of the world cult. Quite honestly, I would like there to be maybe like a Louis Theroux documentary.
I'm not comfortable with the idea that an end of the world cult is something that exists, and I'm pretty thankful that the only ones that I've heard of are very, very religiously motivated, because something that I was discussing on Twitter very recently is we live in a world where there is conceivably within the next 40, maybe even 30, as low as 20 years, there will be exactly 0 humans on Earth who have ever known a world where humanity does not have the power of near-instant self-obliteration. Because think about it, it has been 70 years since the A-bomb was dropped. So pretty much all of the people who were born before that are going to die pretty soon. So it's just this really terrifying thing to think about, that like the capacity to end human life as we know it, which from our perspective is basically the same thing as ending the world, is both within our grasp and connected to motivations that we as beings might have.
Dang.
It is absolutely horrifying to think about, and that's probably why we generally don't.
Yeah.
It's definitely the kind of thing where it's like we are in the extended epilogue of some disaster story, where it's like, because that's the thing, you can't put that back. That's not something that we, for as long as we remain a civilized society, can unlearn.
That's true, yeah.
Like, we will always have this capacity, even if we don't exercise it. Anyway, this has been House of Bards. I have been Alex, and this has been Beth.
This has been Beth. You can contact me on @BaronessBamf. It's the same on Twitter and on Tumblr. If you have any comments or any theories, absolutely.
You could also use the hashtags House of Bards, that's all one word, on Twitter, but split it out into multiple words anywhere that will allow you to do that. I can be contacted on Twitter and Tumblr as @CleaverCrumbish. That is CleverCrumbish. It's spelled in the description, you know where to look. Honestly, I don't know what kind of royalty-free images are going to be available for this particular topic, so I will put also a credit for the album art in the description. The music was by Kevin MacLeod, as you probably know, but as we will continue to state, just in case this gets reposted somewhere else, and try and think a bit more about the fact that you have never, ever known a humanity that does not have the power of complete and utter self-destruction within a matter of minutes.